topic of today's webinar is mainstreaming, and I think that NDCs are also fitting very well because, as you experienced, it requires a lot of horizontal cooperation to establish the NDCs, to prepare the document, to agree on a target, to agree on a mission path. And in the next step, it will also require a lot of vertical cooperation to ensure the implementation, not only on the national level, but on the regional and on the local level. So for this topic, I think this is fine, because originally we planned it to present during the COP, to present it to a broader audience. But today, this is also a very good opportunity. Just to summarize a bit on this first slide, what was the support provided by the EU for Climate project? And the project worked closely with Armenia, Belarus, Moldova, and Azerbaijan in its preparation, which included the setting of emission scenarios, mitigation potentials, and the final preparation of the document. Georgia and Ukraine prepared it by themselves or with other support, and the EU for Climate project supported actions to raise awareness and communication, and we will also hear about this later in a case study. And the Ukraine is supported by preparing the NDC implementation roadmap, which is just ongoing. So I also would like to do a look backwards and not only presenting the NDC targets to see how different the countries are. Although you're in one region, but each country has a different economic main activity. Is it agriculture, or is it more service-based? Is it oil-based? So this also influences the emission trends. And as we see here, it ranges from minus 18% in the last 10 years, from 2010, to an increase of greenhouse gas emissions to up to 30%. So as you can see here, Ukraine achieved an emission reduction. Belarus and Moldova, it's rather stable in the last years, and whereas Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, emission have been increasing. And as a comparison with the EU, looking at the numbers, the emission development since 2010, in the EU, emissions decreased by almost 14%. So this is rather the where we should get, but this is not efficient because as we heard last week, or it's already 2 weeks in the COP negotiation in Glasgow, one of the outcomes was the Glasgow Climate Pact, and herein it was reinforced that it makes a huge difference if we aim for 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and if we keep up our efforts to stay within a temperature increase of 1.5, we would need a global reduction of emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to 2010. So just having this in mind in relation when looking to our greenhouse gas trends since 2010, we all notice that there is much more to do, and we can't carry on with business as usual. And it's also one outcome in the Glasgow Climate Pact is net zero around mid-century. So this is reinforced, and so we are not quite on track. And this was also interesting in Melanie's presentation, because she also showed us what the current projections show. And of course, they do not take into account the Fit for 55 package, but still the EU was or is aiming for a reduction of minus 55%, although the projections are not showing this yet. So this should not hinder oneself to have ambitious targets, even from a current perspective. It's not sufficient. Coming back a bit to the current situation, and here is the greenhouse gas intensity expressed as greenhouse gas emissions per GDP. And we see that Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova are all very much in the same range, having a number of between 1 and 2 kilotons CO2 equivalent per million GDP. and it's going up to, in Ukraine, it has the highest greenhouse gas intensity with 2.4. And this is, for example, Georgia has a relatively strong service and agricultural economic sector, where Azerbaijan is more an oil and gas-based economy, and Ukraine has a strong industrial capacity, although the GDP fluctuated in recent years due to the conflicts in the eastern region. And every country has its story, and that's why it differs. But taking this in comparison with the EU average, we all see that the EU is has a better energy intensity than the countries of the Eastern Partnership. Looking at greenhouse gases and population, it's a development experienced by Armenia and Georgia and also Ukraine, that the population is decreasing, has been decreasing in the last couple of years, and also Moldova. And greenhouse gases have, as we have seen it before, increased in several countries. We also see very different ranges of emissions per person. But again, here, Armenia, Moldova, and Georgia are in the same range. And then it's followed by Azerbaijan and Belarus, and Ukraine having the highest greenhouse gas intensity. But it's still, when now here it's the EU average, not the average, the EU number on the right-hand side is even higher than the Ukraine. So to set the stage, now we're coming to the results, and you can see here each column represents 1 year, and maybe you ask yourself why for Moldova and Azerbaijan the recent years are not available, because these are non-Annex 1 countries, and they are not required to submit always the latest greenhouse gas inventory in the year after. So this is on, that's why only for Belarus and Ukraine, which are Annex 1 countries, data for 2019 is also available. But what is more interesting to see what the targets are. These are only, I have to notice, the unconditional targets, because as we know, Belarus, Georgia, and Moldova also presented conditional targets, conditioned that they receive financial and technical support. Here it's only the unconditional targets, and it's everywhere. All the targets include LULUCF except for Georgia. And what the main point is, that all countries except Moldova and except Ukraine are allowed according to the target in 2030 to increase their emissions up to a level of 60% of their 1990 level, or 65% for Belarus and Georgia. And as we heard for Azerbaijan, that the NDC target will also be in the range of 34 to 40% reduction compared to 1990. So it will be as well here somewhere. And this having in mind, and that we need emission peaking and reduction until 2030, it might be necessary to strengthen and to revisit this again. And we can see that Moldova has the strongest, the toughest target, and it needs a reduction of 1% compared to its emission level in 2016. And Ukraine is also needs a reduction of 3% from its current level in 2019. So this should be achievable, especially as we had in all countries, I guess, emission decreases in recent years and current years due to the pandemic. Now looking a bit to the comparison of your NDCs, the initial NDCs submitted sometime in 2016 in most countries, and now the NDCs. And for Armenia, it's a major step forward that it changed from an intensity target to a relative target. which makes it much more comparable and transparent. So this is this, and it also included now a renewable objective, and has a target which also includes LULUCF, and it's an unconditional target, whereby the target of -40% is the same for with and without LULUCF. In Belarus, the main improvement was that it's now also including LULUCF, and a very extensive work on emission modeling was done to get the range of a possible target, and it provides an unconditional and a conditional target. Georgia changed also the way or the type of target, because before it was referencing the business as usual scenario, and now it's the reference year is 1990, which also makes it more comparable to other countries and more transparent. So this is a big improvement, and it's the NDC also includes sectoral goals. So not only the overall economy-wide emission reduction targets, but also sectoral goals. In Moldova, as already mentioned, it's the country with the highest ambition. This was also the case in the NDC, and now this was even strengthened to, under the conditional scenario, up to 88% reduction compared to 1990. And Moldova is one of the countries which has a very extensive adaptation part added to its NDC, and this is yeah, one of the best practice cases how this can be communicated. And the last country in the alphabetical order, Ukraine. Ukraine increased its ambition considerable to -65% without LULUCF. It's the unconditional scenario, and it's what is important in Ukraine, that in the NDC it is also stated that climate neutrality is to be achieved by 2060. This is the vision, and this is also very good if this is stated somewhere. Yeah. Now a quick outlook to the implementation, how the countries are approaching the implementation process. And in Armenia, the national implementation plan is under preparation. And this was also mentioned today, that it plans to make use of the debt for climate mechanism for domestic actions, which means that debts can be relieved in exchange for the implementation of climate actions. In Belarus, the extensive work for the NDC already included a roadmap of the actions needed for a 5-year period and also longer, and it included also the definition of specific indicators to develop a monitoring scheme. In Georgia, there is this 2030 climate change strategy with sectoral targets. These are also reflected in the NDC and is accompanied by a short-term action plan, which has always a 2-year time frame. So this is a very concrete planning. Similar, this is the case in Moldova, because they already had a low emission development program, which was reflecting the NDC, and this has now been updated to reflect the increased ambition presented in the NDC. And this program is also including a concrete action plan. And in Ukraine, the action plan, also we heard it today in the presentation, is currently under development together with a financial planning and a monitoring framework. So this is very much needed, because the documents, the NDCs, are not the final step, because they are the first step. Now we have submitted these documents, and now it goes into implementing these, which will be in some cases even more difficult. So this is my last slide, some considerations. in view of the outcome of the COP. So we have to think, or we and together with the countries have to think, when will emissions peak? Because it's not clear for all the countries when will we reach our emission peak and what is the time when it really starts decreasing. The Glasgow Climate Pact also mentions the phase down of coal. This was a big discussion if it's phase down or phase out, but it's important that it's there, I think. And we also have to think this will come. It is unavoidable, and as it needs some transition time, it is important to plan it. This is not something which can be implemented in a couple of years. It's need long-term planning. So, and this has been stated in the last COP conference as well. Its coal is at its end. Methane, it's sometimes a bit forgotten. Everyone talks about CO2, but methane is short-lived and has therefore a large potential to make an immediate effect on our global warming, also because it is 25 times or 28 times as strong as CO2. I think more than 100 countries signed this methane pledge. So I think it's also a good way to think, also concentrate on methane emissions. Where do they come from, and to make efforts to really estimate them well, especially the fugitive emissions. These are sometimes quite carry a high uncertainty, so it's important to put a focus on these fugitive emissions. Also, the fossil fuel subsidies, they are everywhere and often they are not well recognized, and we invest a lot of money in avoiding the use of fossil fuels, but on the other way we subsidize them, and to make really have a clear overview where are going these subsidies. And the one outcome was also that countries are, I think it was invited, or it's not a mandatory requirement, but ambitions can be increased during the year 22 to be in line with the long-term target of carbon neutrality, and to think if the contribution is sufficient to be in line with the global needed pathway of minus 45% by 2030. And my last lesson learned from the COP was that the monitoring, the transparency framework, this is an important element, because otherwise we cannot show what we did, we cannot track our progress, and we need to do this now, because we are now in the critical decade until 2030. The picture must change, the system must change. If we start with this in the next 10 years, it will be probably too late.